So you want to own a medieval alchemist's laboratory. In your head it's simple: a stone workshop lit orange by a slow-burning furnace, glass vessels beating with condensation, a patron's messenger waiting outside for word that today might finally be the day. Shelves sag under jars of colored powder. Somewhere behind a locked door sits the one manuscript that supposedly holds the final missing step. That part is real. Men built exactly this room, in exactly this posture, for close to 4 centuries, from the university towns of 13th century Europe to the imperial court at Prague. Nobody tells you the part that matters first, though. The gold was never the product. The waiting was. Start with the number that undoes the fantasy before you've even lit the furnace. In 1404, under King Henry IV, the English crown passed a statute now known to legal historians as the Act Against Multipliers, and it did something almost nobody expects from a law aimed at a scientific pursuit. It made the actual stated goal of your business a felony. Attempting to multiply gold or silver by any craft, without the crown's express license, became a criminal offense punishable by forfeiture of everything you owned, land, house, and goods, to the crown itself. The statute stayed on the books, technically enforceable, until it was finally repealed in 1689, nearly 3 centuries later. Historians who've worked through the surviving patent rolls note the strange twist sitting right alongside it. The same crown that criminalized transmutation spent the following 150 years quietly granting individual licenses, exempting specific named men from that exact law. You weren't entering an unregulated craft the way a candlemaker or a cooper was. You were entering a business where the finished product, if you ever actually produced it, was illegal to possess without a permission slip from the king himself. There were 3 real ways into this business, and the gap between them tells you almost everything about how it actually functioned. At the bottom sat the household practitioner, a figure closest to what most towns would simply have called an apothecary who happened to keep a furnace. Entry here cost you a genuine but modest outlay compared to what came later. A small brick athanor, the slow, self-feeding furnace that alchemical work depended on for its steady, unattended heat, ran a household a real but manageable sum, roughly comparable to what a working family might spend outfitting an entire kitchen. Glassware came next, and it was never a one-time cost. Alembics for distillation, retorts, cucurbits, and pelican flasks, each one blown by hand by a glassworker who charged accordingly, and each one a total loss the moment it cracked under sustained heat, which happened constantly and had to be budgeted for as an ongoing operating expense rather than a single purchase. Raw materials followed on a running basis: mercury, sulfur, saltpeter, alum, and vitriol, purchased from apothecaries or importers at prices that moved with supply and demand the way any traded commodity does. Mercury in particular carrying real volatility because so much of Europe's supply moved through a small number of mines in Spain and the Balkans. Underneath all of it, quietly, sat the largest line item of all: books. A single hand-copied and illustrated alchemical manuscript could cost more than a skilled craftsman earned in an entire year, because there was no printing press turning out cheap copies until deep into the 15th century, and the accumulated knowledge simply didn't exist reliably anywhere else. What you got for all of that was the right to work quietly in your own house, sell whatever genuine remedies and preparations came out of the same equipment along the way, and chase the larger goal privately, on your own schedule, answerable to nobody but yourself. One level up sat the guild apothecary, and here entry meant joining an organized trade the same way a brewer or a goldsmith joined a livery company in a city like London. In England, this eventually formalized into the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, which broke away from the much larger Grocers' Company and received its own royal charter in 1617. Getting in cost you a 7 or 8 year apprenticeship bound under a master already inside the trade, a binding legal contract enforceable in court, and entrance fees on qualification that functioned as a genuine barrier rather than a polite formality. What you bought with all of that was the guild seal of approval stamped on your preparations, legal standing to sell physic and distilled waters across a wealthy urban market, and crucially, a layer of institutional cover money couldn't otherwise buy. If suspicious questions ever arose about exactly what was happening behind your shop's backroom, you were a licensed member of a chartered livery company answering to your peers, not a lone man with a furnace and an unexplained quantity of mercury. At the very top sat the court alchemist, and here the entry cost wasn't measured in guild fees or apprenticeship contracts at all. It was patronage. The clearest version of this scale played out in Prague under the Habsburg Emperor Rudolf II, who by the final decades of the 16th century had turned his own court into the single largest concentration of alchemical activity anywhere in Europe, drawing practitioners inward from Poland, England, and the Italian states into laboratories built directly into the walls of Prague Castle. Getting a seat here cost a skilled practitioner nothing upfront and offered something almost unfair in return: a full annual stipend, imported materials paid for entirely out of an imperial treasury, servants and assistants to keep multiple furnaces running around the clock, and direct, standing access to a patron with essentially no practical ceiling on what he was willing to spend chasing a single result. The catch sat inside that same arrangement, and it defines this entire trade more than any other single fact. Here's the mechanism. A patron did not fund an alchemist in order to buy gold. Gold he already possessed, or could acquire through taxation, trade, or conquest far more reliably than through a laboratory that had never once succeeded anywhere in recorded history. What a patron actually purchased, month after month, was the right to be the man standing there if it ever worked, plus something considerably more reliable in the meantime: hope, sold on a renewable subscription, kept alive for as long as the alchemist could keep producing small, plausible signs of forward progress. A purified metal that looked meaningfully different from where it started. A convincingly colored tincture that shifted shade under heat the way the old texts promised it should. A learned, technically fluent explanation for why last month's attempt had failed, one that pointed toward impure starting materials, an incorrectly calculated planetary alignment, or a subtle error in proportion, rather than toward the much simpler explanation that the entire underlying premise was false. The promised transmutation was the pitch that opened the funding relationship in the first place. The actual, sustainable business running quietly underneath it was everything else the same laboratory produced along the way: medicinal elixirs sold to wealthy households, distilled essences and perfumes, dyes and pigments supplied to manuscript illuminators and painters' workshops, ink production, and metallurgical assay work testing the true purity of ore and coin for mints and merchants who needed a trustworthy, technically skilled third party to tell them exactly what they were dealing with. A finished tincture sold to a nervous patient might fetch a handful of coins on a good week. A single commissioned, astrologically timed preparation for that same patient's entire household could cover a modest laboratory's expenses for a full season. Sit with that gap for a second: a street apothecary's cheapest remedy sold for pennies, and a court alchemist's single commission service could fund an entire quarter's furnace fuel. Nobody serious in this trade was actually getting rich waiting for lead to become gold. Skilled practitioners were making a genuine, if structurally unstable, living from everything real chemistry could produce while that unfulfilled promise stayed alive in the background, still funding the room. You'd naturally assume a single failed transmutation attempt ended the arrangement outright. It rarely did, and this is exactly where the mechanism turns genuinely strange. Sunk cost worked in the alchemist's favor with the same force it exerts on any modern investor reluctant to walk away from a losing position. A patron who had already spent years and a genuine fortune building and staffing a laboratory was far more inclined to fund one more attempt than to publicly admit the entire premise had been mistaken from the very beginning, and the more skilled practitioners in this trade understood that psychology completely and priced their behavior around it. So the alchemist produced just enough real, tangible medicine to keep justifying the household's continued interest between attempts. The assistant kept the furnace burning through the nights nobody else was watching, because an athanor that went cold meant restarting the slow accumulation of heat from nothing, sometimes losing weeks of progress toward a single planned distillation. And the excuse for that month's failure arrived dressed in enough genuine, technically correct chemistry, wrong proportions, insufficiently purified mercury, an unfavorable conjunction not accounted for, that it sounded to an educated patron like a solvable engineering problem rather than a false premise dressed up in Latin. The invisible cost sitting underneath the entire arrangement was the practitioner's own body. Mercury and lead were constant working materials in this trade, handled daily and often heated directly, and chronic exposure produced tremors, cognitive decline, and premature death across multiple documented cases of working alchemists and their assistants, a slow bill that never once appeared on any ledger a patron ever reviewed. And running underneath the whole arrangement sat the same legal threat the Act Against Multipliers had built into English law from the very start, and versions of which existed across other kingdoms as well. Success itself was legally dangerous. If your laboratory actually produced something that looked convincingly like refined gold, you now possessed material you had no clear legal right to have made, sitting inside a house that a suspicious neighbor, a jealous rival, or an unpaid creditor could report directly to the crown. The safest outcome for an alchemist, in the narrow legal sense, was very often continued, respectable, well-documented failure. The clearest proof of exactly how this played out belongs to Edward Kelly, an English alchemist who spent years working alongside the scholar and mathematician John Dee, first in England and then across the courts of Central Europe, before eventually landing in the orbit of Rudolf Tussprague. Kelly rose remarkably high inside this system, further than almost any other documented practitioner of his era. Contemporary court records indicate he was formally granted a title of nobility by the emperor himself, a clear mark of how seriously his claimed progress was being taken at the very top of the trade, and a real measure of how much the patronage model could deliver to a practitioner who played the long game well. Then the pattern broke sharply the other direction. When Kelly's promised results kept failing to materialize on the timeline Rudolf's patience could tolerate, the emperor had him imprisoned at Krivoklat Castle. Historical accounts describe Kelly dying in the late 1590s from injuries sustained during an attempt to escape confinement, a court alchemist's career ending not in a bankruptcy filing or a quiet retirement but in a locked tower room. The lesson buried inside that story isn't really about Kelly's chemistry. It's about what happens to a business whose entire funding model runs on a single patron's patience the moment that patience finally, irreversibly runs out. Set that failure next to the one story in this trade that actually worked, just not in the direction anyone intended. In 1701, the young alchemist Johann Friedrich Böttger claimed in Berlin to have produced gold through transmutation, a claim serious enough that word of it reached Augustus the Strong, Elector of Saxony, who promptly had Böttger brought to Dresden and effectively imprisoned him there under armed guard to force him to reproduce the result on demand. Böttger never produced gold. What his forced, well-funded laboratory work eventually produced instead, after years of experimentation with clays and firing temperatures originally aimed at a completely different goal, was the first true hard-paste porcelain made in Europe, a formula the Chinese had guarded for centuries and European courts had been desperately trying to replicate. That discovery became the Meissen Porcelain Manufactory, founded in 1710, and it is still producing porcelain under that same name in 2026, well over 300 years later. Böttger himself never got the freedom, and never got rich the way the fantasy promises. What he actually built, without ever intending to, was the one laboratory in this entire story whose real output turned out to be worth vastly more than the gold everyone had originally locked him up to find. Two things separated the practitioners who lasted decades inside this trade from the ones who didn't, and neither one involved actually getting closer to real gold. The first was diversification away from the impossible product and toward the genuinely useful one. The physician and alchemist Paracelsus, working across German and Swiss territories in the early 16th century, built his entire lasting reputation not on transmutation but on applying alchemical technique directly to medicine, refining mineral compounds into treatments and effectively founding what later historians call iatrochemistry, chemistry aimed squarely at healing rather than at gold. That reorientation gave him something a pure transmutation chaser never had: income and reputation independent of whether the larger project ever succeeded at all. The laboratory treated medicine as its real, saleable product rather than its cover story. Dye and pigment orders from local workshops were steady, dependable revenue, not a distraction from the real work. Assay contracts for a local mint got priced and delivered on schedule the way any other skilled trade would deliver a commission. The second thing that separated survivors from failures was managing the patron relationship itself with real discipline, delivering small, credible, independently verifiable results on a steady, predictable schedule, rather than making one enormous claim and then going silent for a year while the furnace burned through the household's money. Silence read to an impatient patron as either failure or outright fraud, and either one, as Kelly discovered, could end in a locked tower rather than a polite dismissal. So, 3 ways this could have actually gone for you, and the numbers move enormously depending on which door you walk through. At the bottom, the household apothecary alchemist working from a modest brick furnace and a shelf of hand-blown glassware could expect a stable, genuinely unspectacular living, selling real remedies, dyes, and distilled waters to a local clientele who never asked what else was happening behind the workshop door, with a larger philosophical project pursued quietly on the side, in the hours between paying customers. There's no realistic path to real wealth at this tier, but the payback period was short, because most of what you were actually selling every week was ordinary chemistry that genuinely worked. In the middle, a licensed guild apothecary operating under a charter like the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries built a comfortable, often multi-generational trade on physic, purges, and preparations sold into a wealthy city market, insulated by the guild's legal standing from the suspicion that followed independent practitioners working entirely on their own. At the very top, a court alchemist under a patron like Rudolph II could receive more material support in a single year, imported minerals, a full domestic staff, an effectively unlimited furnace budget, than either of the other two tiers saw across an entire decade of steady trading, and could, like Kelly, rise to genuine hereditary nobility on the strength of promised progress alone. The downside at that tier was never bankruptcy. It was a locked room in a castle the moment the promise finally came due, and no guild membership or apothecary's charter to fall back on when it did. If there's a version of this story that ends the way the best-run monasteries and guilds across medieval Europe did, in an institution that quietly outlived every single person who ever worked inside it, it belongs to Florence rather than Prague. The Officina Profuma Pharmaceutica di Santa Maria Novella began as a workshop run by Dominican friars who cultivated herbs and distilled remedies, tinctures, and perfumed waters for their own monastery infirmaries starting around 1221. It never once staked its entire survival on a single impossible breakthrough the way a court laboratory did. It sold what it could actually and reliably make: medicines, perfumes, distilled preparations, and it kept selling exactly that, generation after generation, long after anyone left alive remembered the names of the friars who first lit its furnaces. That business is still operating today, in 2026, on largely the same premises in Florence, one of the oldest continuously running pharmacies anywhere on Earth. Nobody who founded it got rich from it directly. The institution itself simply never depended on any single person, or any single miracle, to keep going into the next century. You thought you were buying a laboratory that made gold. What you were actually buying, every single month, was a patron's continued willingness to believe that this time, finally, might be different, purchased with real medicine, real chemistry, real porcelain if you were fortunate enough to fail in exactly the right direction, and a furnace that could never once be allowed to go cold. The gold was never the product. The waiting was. Somewhere in Prague, behind a locked tower door, that waiting eventually came due.